Hello 1301 students, this is Patrick here, and today we're going to be talking about medium and mediums that is used in art. Just what is media and medium? As defined by the textbook, is the physical material that's used in making the work of art. The media is what makes the art a physical thing. It is a drawing, it is a painting, a print, and so on and so forth. Understanding this media is incredibly important because medium is the message. It is the thing that you look at, it is the artwork that you physically experience. This medium can be made of any material that the artist chooses to use. It can be made out of ink, paint, clay. It can also have material that we consider support material. Support material is whatever the artist places the media on. It is the canvas, it can be wood panel, or it could be a pedestal on which an artwork is placed on. When we talk about the media itself, it can be paint, it can be clay, it can be sheets of metal. It could also be parts that you don't see in the final image, but was part of the process. Think of photography. You only see the photograph. You don't see the negative or the Photoshop file. All material used to make the artwork can be considered support material. The textbook uses very general terms to define media. It breaks it down into two categories. We have 2D art and 3D art. 2D art is one of the oldest forms of artwork, and it seems to be innate in humanity. We have other categories in media. It could be considered dry media, wet media, or printmaking. Dry medium is basically a material that the artist uses to leave a mark on a surface that is dry, and the artist manipulates it when applied to the support surface. We can think of these such as pencil, charcoal, chalk, pastels, and silver point. The pencil is the most common drawing tool. It is a graphite rod that is encased in wood or placed inside of a metal holder. It is available in various hardnesses and shades. These different shades offer greater control over the final image by varying the darkness of the mark as well as the ability to render fine details. In this example, American artist Ed Ruscha, who uses graphite and graphite powder to create these very large-scale drawings. He's very careful with the shading, and it creates these sort of optical illusions because of its scale and because of the medium. It is both photorealistic, yet very much a sketch drawing, creating a very unexpected and pleasant effect while viewing them. Charcoal is another dry medium. It's very similar to graphite, but it's made out of compressed sticks of wood and charcoal, obviously. It offers deep, rich blacks and is available in several hardnesses, lends itself to laying down a lot of material very quickly. This is helpful if the artist is making very large gesture sketches, where the paper is so large, a pencil would not be able to keep up with the artist's hands. In this Henri Matisse drawing, you can see that he is using charcoal to capture the figure. He is drawing it multiple times with multiple layers, one on top of another, and is using either a smudge stick or a piece of paper to sort of smooth out the lines. He is building up line on top of line to create a sense of movement, motion, and volume. You can see that the details are really not quite there. However, the important use of charcoal is in its ability to create things fast and quick. Chalk and pastels are colored material. typically held together with wax or maybe a glue, and it is shaped into sticks. Depending upon the composition of the glue and wax, you can create a very soft, smudgy sort of look, or a very high detail, sharp look. Pastels didn't really exist until the late 19th century, when industry started to revolutionize artist materials. Before artists pick up a box, and because they're relatively affordable and easily replaced, artists were more adventurous and would draw what they saw around them. So instead of asking a dancer to visit a studio, artists would actually go into the world, and they would draw the dancers in their natural environment. This creates an interesting effect. Not only is the artist now freed up from having to do all of their work trapped inside of a room, it allows them to be a lot more experimental in rendering color as well as light. Degas was an artist in Paris, and instead of having a studio where he would work, he would grab a box of his charcoals. He would go to cafes and would draw from life. This sort of explains how his images have a almost snapshot aesthetic, where it's not about a proper pose in a traditional sense, but rather the artist is trying to capture a fleeting moment. Silver point drawing is when you're drawing with a silver stylus. The support material, if you remember, is whatever the artist is drawing on. And in this case, the support material has to be specially prepared for silver point. The artist would start out with either a sheet of paper or a wooden panel. Remember, this is going to be the support material. And then the artist would prepare it by coating it with a material called gesso, sometimes called a ground. Gesso is basically made up of several materials such as bone, chalk, and glue, mixed together to create sort of a thick paste. This paste is applied to the surface, and then once it's dried, it makes the surface ready for the silver point. The artist then would draw on the specially prepared surface and would leave a very sort of faint mark. Since the gesso is very rough, like fine sandpaper, it would remove a very thin layer of silver and embed it inside the paper. The lines themselves are very fine. These old silver point drawings have exquisite detail as well as very good archival properties. In this example from Hans Holbein, the image itself is pretty stable and looks as fresh as it did hundreds of years ago. We have wet medium. By its namesake, wet medium is anything that is sort of applied or manipulated by the artist while it is wet. The artist uses paint or ink and will manipulate that paint or ink with either a brush or a pen. It is typically a black, thick liquid that is applied to a surface, typically paper. And once it dries, it's a very permanent image. It can be made of many different types of things. In history, it has been used with either iron or organic materials, such as the ink found in squids. Ink itself can then also be applied in different ways. If you look at ink that was applied with a brush, such as this example of a sakura tree, you can see that the artist is creating big, thick, bold lines. It lacks a lot of subtle detail. However, it creates these sort of soft edges and thick volumetric shapes, leaving sort of a very graphic and pleasing composition, where the importance is more on compositional elements rather than the fine details in sort of a graphic description. In this example, we see a drawing made by Henri Toulouse-Lautrec, and he is drawing from life. Because the pen nib is so tiny and so finely pointed, the artist can make fine, delicate lines, giving it an almost sketchy feel. The thickness is pretty uniform, and instead of the brush describing thick, volumetric areas, pen is more about bringing out and describing details. Paintings are a very traditional method of making art. Paintings are typically the first thing a person thinks of when you tell them to describe art. It is a painting of some sort. But what is painting? Painting is actually a way to describe many different processes. There's not just one kind of paint. There are many kinds, and even if two artists are using the same material, the artwork can look radically different from one another. The composition of paint is made up of two key components: pigment and binder. Pigment is intense and pure color. They can be derived from plants or animal matter, and they take something like, say, berries or grass or fruits and would sort of grind them into a powder, creating pure expressions of color. And then they would mix it in with sort of another material. This binder holds on to the pigment, keeps it wet, and makes it easy to apply the paint onto that surface. There are many different kinds of binders. There's egg yolk, wax, glue, oils, polymers, sometimes called acrylic. All of these sort of binders have different characteristics in how they dry and how the artist can easily manipulate the paint to get the desired effect. There are also some processes that do not use binders at all, and they just work with pigments alone. Early caveman drawings were basically pure pigments such as crushed up burnt bone and wood and berries, and were applied directly onto a cave wall with their bare hands. Makeup can also be applied with very little binders and just rely on the pigments themselves. And again, the surface themselves, the support material, it can be made of many different types of materials, such as canvas, wooden panel, paper, as long as the surface is prepared by the artist and the paint adheres to it and is durable, it can be used as a support material. Some of the earliest expressions of painting were actually frescoes. Frescoes are different from paintings because instead of painting onto a prepared surface that is portable, a fresco is a painting that's actually a part of that wall. And when talking about different types of frescoes, there are two main traditional techniques for fresco paintings. You have fresco secco, which is applied after a wall has been completed and finished. The artist mixes another layer of plaster mixed in with pigments to create a thin layer of paint and color, whereas bon fresco is a wet process in which the wall is painted as it is being constructed. It takes a lot more time and a lot more material, is a much slower process compared to fresco secco. However, it is much more durable because incidental scuffs and knocks over time, instead of scraping away the paint and revealing the white surface below it, with a bon fresco painting, whatever gets scraped away will have that same color a little bit more below the surface. So they tend to be a little bit more brighter, they tend to survive a little bit better, and they also have the most durable finishes. Painting can be defined by the binder agent, and we have several different kinds. Tempera is a type of paint that is mixed in with egg yolk. Egg yolk is a very good material because it is extremely common. It is also quick setting, adds a lot of sharp edges, and has an ability to render really good detail. Today, if you see tempera paints for sale, chances are they're not using actual egg yolks. Instead, they're using synthetic variations. However, it tries its best to replicate those traditional qualities. Watercolors are pigments that are suspended in gum arabic. These pigments stay suspended in the binder until it evaporates, leaving behind only stains. Gouache watercolor is pretty much the same as regular watercolor, except there's a little bit of white chalk mixed into it. This eases the control of the medium. Artists have the ability to sort of lay the colors on a lot quicker to get to the effects with less washes. Watercolor and gouache work very well with mixed media, as the pigments can lay on top of any kind of surface. Gymnastic painting is an ancient form of painting. Instead of suspending the pigments in a binder such as gum arabic, the artist would mix it with beeswax. They would heat up the beeswax and pour in tiny amounts of pigment, and then very quickly would manipulate the sort of waxy material until it dries, leaving the pigments suspended in a thin layer of beeswax. If the artist wanted to make changes or corrections or to continue working with the painting, all they would need to do is heat up a special tool which would melt the wax locally, allow them to make subtle and small changes. Because the pigments are suspended in an inert material such as wax, the colors would stay incredibly vibrant and saturated, as well as lasting for a very long time with very little degradation to the final image. As long as the paintings were well taken care of, they created very unique images where detail and sharp colors could coexist in a painting. Oil and acrylic paintings are the most traditional of painting mediums. Oil paints is typically used in conjunction with glazes. An artist would prepare a canvas or a wood panel and would apply a layer of glaze. A glaze is basically a transparent oil that is sort of used to prepare the surface. And it can be applied again and again on top of one another, allowing the artist to be able to go back and rework their paintings over time. The process is incredibly laborious, but it has a lot of benefits, such as the ability to go back even years after work was finished, pull off the glaze in one way or another, and the paint would still be wet, allowing the artist to continue their work. Also, because these transparent glazes could build up small little layers, it kind of adds a luminous quality to the paint, creating a soft glow-like effect, if done correctly. Not all oil paints are applied in the same way. As you can see in this example by Francois Lepage, this still life is made with oil on canvas. However, what strikes you about this piece is subtle colors and fine details that are present in the flowers as well as the birds. You can almost see the light sparkle, leaving a very, very beautiful effect that is both striking and also mesmerizing. Compare that to Gerald Murphy's painting of Watch. He uses the same materials, it's oil on canvas. However, the artist is using the oil on canvas in a very different way. The colors are flat, they are very uniform. The edges are sharp, the lines are clean. It is a very graphic description of the clockwork inside of a pocket watch. So the materials doesn't always have to dictate what something looks like. So be aware that Material itself doesn't mean the painting is going to look a certain way. It's just something for the artist to manipulate to get something that they want out of it. The second artist was using alla prima. This is a process which uses a single layer. The artist is not using glazes to build up color, luminosity, or shading. It is a single layer that is very quick, is worked, and is finished in one sitting. Oil paint is just simply pigments that is suspended in a slow drying oil. By the mid-20th century, new materials such as polymers and acrylics were introduced into painting. Acrylic is very similar to oil paint. Pigment is suspended in a synthetic polymer rather than that slow-drying oil. The big differences between oil paint and acrylic paint is that it is a very fast-drying material and it can be applied to any surface, meaning the artist didn't have to specially prepare a canvas before painting it. They can paint on an unprepared canvas or any other sort of surface they fancy. Another benefit to using acrylic is that it is made of plastic, and plastic is very flexible. One downside of using oil is that it can become very fragile over time. Heat and humidity can create cracks, flakes, and if a painting is not well taken care of, it can become completely ruined within just a few decades. Acrylics, on the other hand, since they're made of plastic, are much less prone to cracking, flaking, and degradation by large swings in temperatures and humidity. We have spray painting. And from spray painting, we really have two different kinds. The first kind is an airbrush. An airbrush is a small little spray gun that is attached to a hose of compressed air and a small little reservoir of paint thinned by alcohol. The air rushes through the gun, siphoning up droplets of paint and applied to any sort of surface. Airbrush has the ability to have lots of control over detail. Also, it allows the artist to use different techniques such as feathering, making soft lines rather than sharp lines. Aerosol cans is another form of spray painting. It is a quick drying paint that is applied to any sort of surface. It is very low detail, however, compared to airbrush, but is very quick to apply and can be used to cover very large surfaces very quickly. The most common example of using spray paint, graffiti, and murals. A good example of graffiti artists would be the artist Banksy. Banksy is an anonymous artist or a collective of artists who are well known for their activist messages embedded within this sort of quite legal display of artwork. In this example here, Banksy is at the West Bank. His image is that of a dove holding an olive leaf while wearing a flak jacket with crosshairs pointing right at its heart. Their type of work is very effective in raising awareness to causes that they believe in. Moving on, we have printmaking. Printmaking is also a wet process. However, instead of relying on unique strokes from a brush or a pen, printmaking is using mechanical machines to reproduce a single image over and over. These multiple impressions are made by either a slab of stone, wood, or metal, a heavy press which applies a lot of pressure, a sheet of paper to sort of receive ink, and ink that is applied to the prepared surface. There are really two categories of printmaking. You have relief printmaking and intallago printmaking. Relief printing uses smooth and malleable surfaces such as wood, rubber, vinyl, or linoleum to create gouges. Intallago uses harder type materials such as metal sheets. The artist would then carve valleys or voids into this material in which the ink would lay inside of it. If you're still confused, let's take a different kind of look at it. In this example here, you see this sort of Pegasus alicorn. You can see the artist has drawn the image that they would like to create. Then the artist uses cutting tools to scrape and gouge away areas in which they do not want the ink to be applied. The raised surface holds the ink, the lowered surface avoids the ink. A thick, highly viscous layer of ink is applied to the surface, and then a paper sheet is laid on top of the block, and then a flat plate is laid on top of that sheet of paper, and it is pressed with a lot of weight, transferring the ink onto that paper. Once the artist is done, they can then repeat that process. Apply the ink, lay the paper, press it down, pull it back, pull off the paper, put down more ink, and so on and so forth, creating a lot of different prints from the same piece of wood. Here is a closer detail of the artist scraping away the material. With intallago printmaking, it is sort of the opposite. The artist takes a very flat polished piece of metal and with the stylus would scrape away material, creating gouges into the metal, sometimes called voids or channels. A different type of ink, which is typically a bit thinner, is applied to the surface. And before the artist places the sheet of paper on top of that plate, the squeegee is sort of run across the surface, leaving only the ink that is puddled in the voids. The paper is then laid on top. It is then exposed to a lot of pressure from another plate. Release, pull off, re-ink, squeegee, paper, press again. The process is very similar. However, it can be just a little bit different. And we can understand those differences by looking at two separate pieces by the same artist using the two different methods described previously. In this example, the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, Albert Dürer is using a woodblock print. Looking very closely, the lines are very heavy. They're very thick, and this is because wood is a relatively soft and organic material. Over time, with each pressing, it slightly deforms the piece of wood because of all of that intense pressure. And so over time, the print changes, little by little. Because of this, you can only make about 200 impressions or prints before the block loses its fine detail and the artist has to start over. A way to sort of combat that, the artist would then compensate by using chunkier line weights, so they're a bit sturdier and a bit more durable. Another limiting factor is the size of wood that is available. Because trees can only grow so big, the prints can only get so big, limiting the final size of their pieces. Now, compare that print with this one, The Night, Death, and the Devil, by the same artist. However, the artist is using an intallago printmaking technique called dry point. And in this, the artist starts with a very large sheet of metal and is using a stylus and a very heavy hand to gouge away the areas in which he would like to leave a line. This makes for images that have very higher detail. It has richer values because they can use techniques such as crosshatching more effectively to describe those tonal values. And because the material is much more durable and stronger than wood, instead of being limited to, say, 200 prints, the artist could make thousands of these prints. Another thing is that the artist can also make these prints as big as they would like. Because the material is metal, metal can be shaped and formed into whatever size the artist would like. They can make very massive prints in comparison to a woodblock print. Other forms of printmaking can use materials such as lithography. Lithography is using a stone instead of a sheet of metal. And instead of making gouges, the artist is using a crayon to create marks on top of this stone. Once the artist is satisfied with the image, the artist will then pour gum arabic right on top of that stone. And because the artist used oily crayons or paints, gum arabic is hydrophobic, meaning it avoids these oily areas. Sort of creating this small, tiny little channels of marks in places that weren't marked. Ink is then placed onto the stone, squeegeed away, paper is laid on top, pressure is applied, and you have a print. Very similar to the other process. Techniques such as registration marking to create a multi-color print. Meaning an artist can then use a variety of different ink colors to create vibrant, colorful prints instead of a more normal, a more drab black and white image. Lithography printmaking flourished in Paris in the 1890s. Paris was going through a revival and a resurgence of culture and industry. New products were being made available, new entertainment venues were opening up. And so advertising started to take advantage of the new technology. In this example, Henri Toulouse-Lautrec is a Parisian who is known for making these lithography prints. He was fast, efficient, and could create vibrant and very dynamic compositions that even today people use in examples of what constitutes as very good graphic design. He would make prints for tire companies, bicycle companies, oil companies, box cookies. In this example, dancers from a dancing troupe. Notice how there are multiple colors and simple lines. The dress is described in blue. The hats are also sort of described in blue. However, their hair has a bit of red and orange. And behind them is a wall of yellow. The text is sharp and also a sort of warmish orange color. And also, let's not forget, there's also a hint of brown present as well. This is all because the artist is using the same stone and creating registration marks to create a multicolor image from a single plate. This was sort of the forebearer of what we know as commercial printing. Other types of commercial printing would be serigraphy. This is sometimes called screen printing. Serigraphy, screen printing, allows prints not only to be made on paper, but also fabric as well. This technique is very popular for applying images to t-shirts and clothes. It uses a screen and a stencil cutout. Ink is sort of forced through this mesh by a squeegee. This technique was further advanced by the photo silkscreen, whereas the stencil was created with the help of a camera and high contrast film. The ability to make high quality silkscreens opened up to anybody with a camera. Finally, we have the monotype. The monotype is very different in that it reintroduces imperfections back into the image. All of the other previous processes do their best to sort of remove variance and create consistent images print after print. A monotype is sort of applied by hand, and it works by a process of transferring from plexiglass onto paper. This transfer is hand rubbed onto the material, which creates subtle little differences and changes, shifts in registration, and details changing over time, from print 1 to the final print. Not a single one would be exact. In this example, Andy Warhol is taking the iconic image of Marilyn Monroe and is sort of playing with her depictions. Starting out, it seems somewhat natural and neutral, if not vibrant in color. However, with each additional print, he's changing and swapping out the ink that's used, creating very strange effects. Also, because he's applying these transfers by hand, sometimes the details don't match up, creating this sort of strange ghosting effect. And finally, because it is sort of a mechanical process that relies on transfers, it can degrade over time. So what may be sharp in one print may be soft or dull in another. This is a process to sort of reintroduce the artist back into the craft, where imperfections is really what makes the art, rather than perfect quality. Because with advanced industrialization, even the cheapest thing can be perfect. The things that aren't perfect are still human. Moving on, we're going to look at 3D art. Now, 3D art is an umbrella term that includes freestanding work and relief sculptures. 3D art has 3 dimensions. It's not just a flat surface, but rather an object that has form and, well, a 3-dimensional object. And we sort of define it in 2 separate classes. And the textbook defines it in 2 separate ways. First, we have a freestanding sculpture. And this is an object that is meant to sort of be seen from all sides. And since it's freestanding, it also assumes that this object can be placed in different settings. A relief sculpture is meant to be seen mostly just from the front. Typically, it is carved out of a single face of stone or wood block, and they tend to be site-specific. A good way to know if the artwork you're looking at is a relief sculpture rather than a freestanding sculpture. A freestanding sculpture, you're able to observe it from 360 degrees. You can walk completely around it and you'll see something that looks finished and intentional. A relief sculpture, if you try to look behind it, is nothing but sort of a raw piece of material. There's also 3D artwork that is site-specific. This is a sculpture that is designed to fit into and interact with elements in one specific location. The Trevi Fountain in Italy is one such example. The Trevi Fountain is tied directly to its location, the Palazzo Poli. The fountain is so iconic, you cannot separate itself from its location. The Trevi Fountain is also one of the oldest fountains in Rome. Therefore, if you remove the sculpture from the fountain, it no longer becomes the Trevi Fountain. Kinetic sculptures are sculptures that are designed to move and is a part of the art piece by design. Looking at the sculpture of Five Hammering Men by Jonathan Borowski, you're looking at a kinetic sculpture. It is freestanding because you can sort of walk around it and amongst it. However, the standout feature is the arms in sort of a swinging hammer motion. The motor in the back is sort of exposed, showing how this kinetic feature is achieved. Little wires are installed for support as well as supplying electricity. And next week, when we take another look at this, we are going to understand what the artist may have been trying to say with this piece. Alexander Calder's Crinkly with a Red Disc is another sculpture that is kinetic. Rather than relying on gears to sort of power the movement, the artwork itself is sort of designed to move with the wind. Knowing the characteristics of Chicago, it is known as the Windy City. Therefore, we can expect that this sculpture gets a lot of movement. Methods and mediums that is used to create 3D art boils down to two different ways of creation. The first is carving. So when the artist starts with a solid material and then removes it. Think of carving something away. Typically this material is made out of wood, metal, marble, stone, or synthetic materials such as styrofoam. To think about it, the artist starts with a big block of something and then removes material until he gets the final sculpture. By contrast, modeling is pushing and building up material to create the final work. Modeling is typically used by a soft, malleable material. It is what we describe as an additive process. Clay is the most popular material and becomes permanently hard after firing. Wax can be another material that's used. The point of the process is that you start with something small, and then through the process of modeling, material is added and taken away, pushed, squished, manipulated until the final form approaches to what the artist intended. And then the sculpture is fired in a kiln, removing the moisture, making the material permanently hard. Another form of modeling is through mechanical extrusion in the form of a 3D printer. 3D printers use a filament or a thin piece of plastic or some other type of synthetic material, and through the process of heating it up and cooling it down, it can layer the materials one on top of another, not unlike that of building a sandcastle. And once it cools and hardens, it becomes semi-permanent. And these two examples, a figure on the left and a figure on the right, clearly demonstrate the differences between modeling and carving. If you look at the model on the left, you see a soft material and it looks incomplete. It needs to have more material added to it. This is indicative of modeling. Whereas on the right, you see a hard stone, and from within it, you see sort of the body of a torso being revealed. The material itself is larger than the final piece, and what the artist needs to do is remove more of that material to carve it away to get to that final piece. That is carving. There's another method called serre perdue. We're not going to go over it in great detail because it's very complex and it can be a little confusing. But what you really need to know about serre perdue is a method of which you start with a soft sort of sculpture such as wax. Once that wax model is made, you then sort of create a cast. With that cast, you melt away the wax, leaving behind an empty chamber. That empty chamber then has hot metal poured into it, creating a permanent, solid statue. This means that you can make multiple copies. Other methods for making three-dimensional art is not just limited to carving and modeling. The method of assembling is basically incorporating different objects and materials, and then you sort of put it all together. This artwork is typically made from various different kinds of material, and it's usually defined as mixed media. They can be made with a mix of found objects that are manipulated into its final form, or the material can be ready-made, that is, incorporating objects as they are available, but then transforming it by changing its context. Joseph Cordell is an American artist who grew up in the early 20th century. He was not a classically trained artist. He couldn't paint, he couldn't draw. However, he had this habit of going to the junk shops around New York City and just buy random things, take it back to his place, and sort of categorize it, for no real particular reason other than he sort of enjoyed doing this sort of thing. One day, he just happened to run across an art curator as they were installing a new show. He was amazed by European artist Max Ernst and his collages. They were strange, they were different, and it also showed him that you could be an artist without being a painter. Max Ernst and his photo collages, made up of other people's photographs, cut up to create a new image. Inspired by this, he goes back to his house and creates these sort of boxes. Within these boxes, he kind of assembles these sort of sculptures that sort of represent ideas, feelings, emotions through transforming or sort of just playing with form. His objects are still considered sculptures. They are completely unique because it relies on careful consideration and careful curation and knowing how and when and where to apply found objects to create an object that is wholly unique and has its own sort of creative form. Newer technologies can transform the possibilities available to 3D art. Sophie Kahn is a digital artist who travels around the city of New York, finding cigarette butts on the ground and get the DNA sequenced. And from there, she makes inferences about what the person may possibly look like. And then she creates a 3-dimensional portrait of them before making the final print of their portraits. She glitches, she corrupts, and sort of drastically changes their appearance. This is because DNA can't really tell us what someone looks like, but only makes very large and vague guesses. She is sort of reintroducing the idea of identity through DNA as something that is incomplete and wholly inaccurate. Installation artwork is artwork that is typically mixed media. It is designed for a specific place, such as an interior or an exterior. Dale Chihuly is a glassblower who is known for making these exquisite glass sculptures. And the city of Dallas commissioned him to make several installations at the Dallas Arboretum. These pieces of artwork are wholly unique to the place in which they were displayed. Once you remove a Dave Chihuly sculpture from the Arboretum, it no longer is that sculpture. You remove it from its context. You remove it from its environment in which it was supposed to exist. Performance art is a live-action event that is staged as an artwork. However, instead of using sculpture or paint, the artist is using the human body. The artist then uses this sort of performance to transform the space and the actors to creating a situation that is designed to create a response from the viewers. Maria Abramovich is one such performance artist who rose to prominence in the 1970s by creating daring and controversial situations to talk about her ideas of femininity, society, good behavior and bad behavior, and who decides what is what. Performance art relies specifically on the performance, obviously. It exists afterwards in the form of documentation, of photographs, and video. Photography is a different kind of art medium. Photography is a very technology-heavy art form, which relies on the science of the day to create images with light. Photography involves a light-sensitive material that is exposed to light in a very brief moment through a lens, and then through either a chemical or digital process, becomes a permanent and fixed image in the form of either a print or a final digital output file. The invention of the photography shakes up the art world. Portraits of family members are no longer being made by artists who may fail to sort of capture the essence of someone. Now you have a purely mechanical, almost completely neutral sort of process to create an even more perfect representation of reality. This completely changes people's opinion on art and its purpose, and exactly what it is that an artist is really trying to do. Before the invention of photography, artists were very focused on the ability to render realistically, to create images that are merely a reflection of perception. The artwork almost looks like a window looking into the world. After the invention of photography, the purpose of art changed. They were no longer burdened with having to represent reality, which allowed them to explore different things, such as the interior of the mind, creativity. How do you express the human spirit? How do you express the human condition? And how can you express it in ways that cannot be told in the same way that a camera could tell it, in the same way that a camera could express it? And so portraits of people would change. High detail was no longer the point. Portraits would be smudgier. They'd be much more apparent that they were paintings rather than photographs, capturing mood and emotion in ways that would be very difficult for a camera to ever capture, pushing colors to unnatural levels, creating images that were not only different, but were incredibly novel when compared to all of human history. Once art was free from trying to describe nature as we see it, art becomes a conduit for creativity and for pushing the mind into areas that it never considered before. The first early techniques of photography was the daguerreotype. It would create a unique, one-of-a-kind object. Prints were actually made on silver, and a light-sensitive material was poured on top of it. While this thin coat of light-sensitive material was wet, the photographer would quickly place this plate into the camera, and before it would dry, the photographer would have to make their exposure, and then rush back into their special room to then create this one-of-a-kind object. The process was toxic, it was explosive, and it was also incredibly labor-intensive. Not to mention, it was a very challenging medium to work with. Shutter times were measured in the minutes. Subjects had to work really hard to not move, which explains why they looked very stiff and unnatural in early photographs. The images themselves are very archival, which is to say some of the earliest photographs survive today, whereas later photographs made on paper, especially some of the earliest ones, have faded away. Photography also allowed people to experiment with the form. This would lead to the idea of the photo montage, or the photo collage. This is a technique in which you can use multiple images to create a new image. One of the earliest examples of manipulated photography was done by a photographer by the name of Oskar Gustav Reichlander. He would make these incredibly intricate tableaus depicting classical society, depicting moral conundrums and theatric displays of the human condition. At this time, photography was not considered an art form, but merely a technological feat. Oskar wanted to change all that by creating these staged images. These photographs were so big and so grand, he could not make just one image in one go. And so he developed a technique of the photo montage, in which he would take multiple photographs of various different actors with various different backdrops, and with careful precision, he would recreate it onto a single sheet of photosensitive paper, making these massive posters that rivaled the size of the great painters. His work was extremely controversial, and not only that, insisting that photography could be art, which is blasphemy at that time, it also depicted the human bodies the same way that they are depicted in paintings. That is to say, there was nudity. And while nudity was common in paintings, it was sort of a cultural distance because it was merely paint on canvas, but not a real person. A photograph was just too much. Nonetheless, Oskar's influence on photography showed that the art form is not merely technical reproduction, but also another in a list of many mediums that artists can manipulate to create different and unique pieces of artwork. Another way in which photography changed people's perceptions of reality was the moving image. The first movie, or sequential set of images, was created by photographer Edward Muybridge. He was employed by Leland Stanford over the bet of whether a horse at full gallop has all four of its hooves leaving the ground for a brief moment. The horses move too fast and too quickly for anybody to make a clear distinction or reliable observation. And so Muybridge was hired to create a contraption to solve this problem. At this time, cameras were really limited to taking only one photograph. And then you have to go through the whole process of removing the glass plate negative, and replacing it with a new one, and taking another picture in the hands of a very accomplished technician. This could take up to 30 seconds. So what solution did Muybridge come up with? Instead of trying to rapidly changing the film out of one camera, instead he took 12 cameras and lined them up against a horse track alongside a straightaway. And in front of each one of these cameras, he had a little bit of string, like a tripwire. When the horse was running at full gallop, it would basically trip all of these tripwires as it would pass in front of the camera. After a little experimentation to get the timing just right, a horse would come by at full gallop, tripping the wires, and thus creating the first moving image, which also benefited Leland Stanford, proving his point that yes, at full gallop, a horse leaves the ground. And not only that, it was such an unexpected way that the horse would move. This is very interesting because it also affected artists. Previously, in paintings before this revelation was made, the horse's gallop at full trot looked awkward, splayed outwards, very unnatural. artists are now kind of using science to better inform, not because it's just better, it's also because the general public expected it. One thing that photography has really opened up artists' perceptions of understanding the world is to understand that time is not always what it seems, and we don't all perceive time in the same way, and time can be sort of shifted into different ways of understanding. Alexei Taratinko, a photographer who lives in Russia, made a series of photographs during the collapse of the Soviet Union. In this, the photographer would set the camera up in these large areas of public transport, typically in front of bus stations and train stations. In the early morning hours when the sun has barely come up. So instead of trying to capture motion, as in a single moment frozen in time, he would leave the shutter open for long durations. For several minutes, he would photograph large masses of crowds funneling in to the nearest train station. And because the exposure occurs over several minutes, there's a lot of movement and a lot of motion. So much movement and motion, it almost feels like you're looking at ghosts. You're looking not at really people, but you're looking at the movement of a massive cloud. It has a sense of weight and a sense of foreboding. So again, photography, or any kind of art, the end-all and be-all should never just be depictions of reality as we know it, but rather to transform our perceptions of reality, to put us just a little off kilter, to make us a little more unsure about what it is about reality that makes it real, and what it is about reality that it can't be. By challenging this, you're sort of kind of questioning and opening people up to think of not only things in one scale, whereas we're just talking about individual people, to think about bigger scales, such as the mass of a population of people, especially a working class, that is sort of dealing with the fall of an empire. By the end of this chapter, I just want you all to be aware that art can be nearly made of anything. It can be imagined any type of medium. An artist can work with anything and everything they choose to work with. An artist can make a painting out of clay. An artist can make a painting, out of paint. They can use whatever it is that they like and to describe things in whatever shapes and whatever forms they would like to use. I'd like to thank you all for coming by this week. Now we'll move on to your week's assignment. This week's discussion can be found in week 4 on the sidebar. Your question this week is to find 2 pieces of artwork, 2 very different pieces of artwork, and I want you to sort of describe its formal qualities, its size, and the material it's made of, and how this material affects the artist's intention. Attach a JPEG of it, of course, and then write about 200 to 300 words about it. Thank you all very much for coming by this week, and I wish you all good health and stay safe. Again, if you have any questions, please send me an email. I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. Until then, see you next week.